Good morning, everyone, or hello, depending on where you are today in the world. We are just about to get started with our discussion for today, thinking about personalized therapies and the future of sort of health and healthcare. We'll give, I can see a lot of folks dialing into the audio, so we'll give you all a minute to get connected and then we'll dive in and get started. We've got a terrific conversation planned today and I want to make good use of everyone's time. All right, I think most people on the line have audio connections, so we'll go ahead and get started. So hello everyone and welcome. My name is Jen Goldsack. I'm the Executive Director here at DiMe. And I am absolutely thrilled to be joined today by my colleagues and collaborators from Deloitte and the ConvergeHEALTH team. I'll let them introduce themselves in just a moment, but for folks on the line who may not have attended one of our events before, let me walk you very briefly through some housekeeping so that you can feel comfortable and so you know how you can get engaged and you can participate in the conversation that we have planned over the next hour or so. So just as a heads up, we will always disclose that today's session is being recorded. The nice thing about that is not only the slides that we share today, but also the recording of this conversation will be shared to the DiMe website. We'll also share it with our Deloitte colleagues in case they want to make use of it. So always want to disclose that. And hopefully if you pick up on any gems today and want to share that with your colleagues, we make plenty of avenues available for you to do so. We also have structured this to hopefully get the most out of the expertise on the line on the presenter side, but also so we can sort of discuss together what the implications of the findings are from the report that we published. Some of you on the line contributed to that, so we're delighted to have learned from you and continue the conversation. And also so that we can learn from you about where we go from here and what the future should look like. The way we'll handle that, you have a couple of mechanisms to get engaged. I'll be watching the participant list. So as we go on and as we move to the Q&A portion, please feel free to raise your hand. Not like this, but actually using the functionality in Zoom. Please also feel free to type your questions either into the chat or the Q&A. If you are somewhere where you can chat, I'll ask you to unmute yourself and you can pose your question live. Otherwise, we'll go ahead, I'll give voice to your question and we'll discuss it here with the team. So with that, welcome everyone, and in particular, welcome to my Deloitte colleagues. And I might go around and ask each of you to introduce yourselves because you'll give it far better voice than I will. So Asif, would you like to go first?
Yes, happy to. And good morning, everyone. I'm Asif Ahmed. I'm a senior manager in our life sciences strategy practice at Deloitte. The work that I do, I lead at the intersection of life sciences commercial strategy and digital transformation. And as you can tell by the paper, I have a passion for driving bold digital transformations with our clients to reimagine the patient experience. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Likewise, and it was tremendous to work with you. Asif, this was such a pleasure and such a great project. Natasha, would you like to go next?
Oh, thank you. I'm very glad to be here and I look forward to this conversation. Thank you, Jen, for having us. Unlike Asif and Brett, I'm in a different part of Deloitte. I'm at the Deloitte Center for Health Solutions, which means that I'm a researcher by training and by profession. I do not do client work. The purpose of our existence is to do research like this and to publish it for public consumption. And the idea is that this research helps our practitioners and our clients stay on top of important issues in the industry.
Natasha, I really like that. And that was one of the wonderful things about this particular collaboration, because it upholds a lot of the values we have here at DiMe, which is we define digital medicine as an evidence-based field, and thus there must be research. We must sort of have the information in hand before we move forward. But also we don't do this work just to admire it. We actually then want to move to action. And so the mechanism you have with your team at Deloitte that can then hand off to the more customer-facing folks was really exciting to us, and I think really helped with the collaboration we have. Brett, last but not least, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself? And then perhaps I'll ask you to go straight from that into maybe sharing with everyone on the line a bit of the backstory for how we got to this particular project and how we wound up collaborating on this and what the impetus was for the questions we asked.
Sure, yeah, happy to, Jen. And I do want to start by saying this has been an awesome collaboration with DiMe from the get-go on the paper with forums like this. We truly believe to achieve personalized healthcare, it's truly a team sport, and that means we all have different roles to play in the ecosystem. So we think DiMe's playing a super critical role to bring evidence to digital health and maybe cut through some of the hyperbole and hype that is out there around it. So super excited to collaborate on this paper and to have this dialogue today, and excited that the participants on the phone also represent a diverse set of players in the ecosystem in and around digital health. So really looking forward to hearing everybody's points of view. So just really quick introduction. Brett Davis, I'm a partner at Deloitte. I have two hats. In my global role, I direct and guide all of our investments in what we call assets, which is kind of a consulting word for our investments in our intellectual property that we bring to our clients. But germane to this conversation, I'm general manager of our ConvergeHEALTH business, and this will get into the origin story, Jen, about why we dove into this paper. So 7 years ago, we recognized that the digitization of healthcare was going to have profound impact on all parts of healthcare, whether that's a life sciences innovator or a medical device company bringing innovation to market, whether that's the tech ecosystem that's playing in healthcare, whether that's a healthcare system, delivering care, or whether that's a government or a health plan reimbursing care, that this digital information and the exhaust of the healthcare system was going to be available for deriving insights going forward, but that many of the systems, the information systems and platforms that were in place 7 years ago weren't really set up to create the learning healthcare system where we truly could learn from all of these interactions that were increasingly being captured in a digital format and derive insights from it to actually drive change. And so that was the impetus for us to invest in ConvergeHEALTH, because we recognized to best serve our clients, we needed to have a home for data scientists, health economists, software engineers, et cetera, that maybe wouldn't be attracted to a traditional management consultancy and career. And so that's the origin of ConvergeHEALTH. And we've been blessed to be very successful working with our clients to build platforms first for real world evidence and really deriving secondary insights from that data. And this gets into the impetus for doing this paper with DiMe. About 5 years ago, we did our first, what we called real world evidence benchmarking survey, where, again, in the spirit of wanting to be evidence-based, we went out and engaged with the market to understand really where were the pain points, the opportunities for use of all this secondary digital data to change the way clinical trials are designed, to change the way we think about value in the healthcare ecosystem. And then what, importantly, not just where the opportunities and challenges were, but what practical steps could be taken to start to address them. And I think that's important. We don't just want to think about these things theoretically. We want to drive towards pragmatic potential solutions for organizations to take to start to address them. And then we view it as our responsibility then to decide where can we best play to help enable that. And that could be investment in a ConvergeHEALTH platform. That could be collaborating with an organization like DiMe. And so if we think about the last 5 years and sort of the real world evidence journey, the regulatory landscape has advanced considerably with the FDA and other regulatory bodies really leaning in to the use of real world evidence for regulatory decisions. We're seeing real world evidence outside of regulatory decisions being used broadly for all sorts of decisions, from making acquisition choices and informing where there's opportunities for untapped value in different patient populations, to clinical trial recruitment, and on and on and on. So real world evidence has matured a lot in the 5 years that we've been doing that study. And what we saw, particularly with our life sciences clients, was that real world evidence centers of excellence and other organizational constructs were popping up. And then we started to see the same thing start to happen with sort of digital centers of excellence within our biopharma and life sciences clients, where, sometimes they were in the commercial organization, sometimes in R&D, sometimes they were enterprise, but the idea was to engage and figure out kind of what did digital health mean for a biopharma company or a medical device company. And the work we were doing with our real world evidence survey, as well as with our clients, we were seeing a disconnect between the two, which represented a real, we think, opportunity, which is a lot of these digital engagement strategies were completely disconnected from the evidence strategies. And the evidence strategies had major gaps because claims data sets and EMR data sets don't fill a lot of the clinical nuance that you can get from a direct to patient engagement in some of the digital health platforms. So that's a long-winded way of getting to this paper, which is we wanted to start taking the pulse of the industry around where are digital medicine products, digital companions, and digital therapeutics, where are we truly at? And is there an opportunity to start holistically, if we use sort of the learning healthcare system as the North Star, really wanting to understand what works for whom, why, and what context, and what cost? Could we start to see digital medicine products, whether that's a companion, a platform collecting data in the context of a decentralized clinical trial, or a digital therapeutic, start to fill some of those evidence gaps? And that was really the reason for the paper, and teaming with you, Jen, to start to hear from the market and then start to put out points of view on, what does good look like today, and perhaps more importantly, what will great look like in the future.
Brett, that was an absolutely tremendous overview. And I also think it's really important how you set that up, which is there are some lessons learned, even from sort of real world evidence and sort of gaps there, and addressing those effectively that we can apply to our learnings here. I think as with a lot of the work we do, we are rarely reinventing the wheel from absolutely nothing. So wherever we can be cross-pollinating learnings, we're delighted to do it. So Brett, some of the elements you teased out, we have summarized here on a slide. For folks on the line, we are not going to do death by PowerPoint. Both the results and these points will be available when we post everything after the session. But there is one slide I want to share briefly for folks who may not have seen it in the paper, and let's use it as a jumping off point for discussion, and I'll stop sharing. One of the things that's resonated, I think, the most as I've watched our DiMe community responding to some of the findings and recommendations from the paper are around the model that we have, and we put the figure up here. What are the key considerations for successful partnerships between sort of digital tech vendors and pharma organizations? And I wonder if we could dive into this a little bit. As I said, I'll stop sharing. What can we learn from the report? And maybe Natasha, you can start there. And then Brett, I'd love to have you sort of chase Natasha here and build on what we found in the report, and maybe couple it with some of your experience through previous work at Deloitte and Converge. Natasha, you have the floor.
Well, you can think about partnership as what are the considerations, as what are the risks that I may be getting myself into. Like if you think about partnering between a pharma company and a technology company, a partner from the pharma perspective, they may be concerned about how long has the tech company been in business? Do they have the track record? Are they going to be financially viable for them to stick around so that we complete the project? Do they have the clinical expertise? So those are the questions that pharma companies may have. And the trade-off may be, okay, I might want to go with a large technology company. So, and this is where they make the trade-off of, okay, the financial backing is there, but do they have the clinical expertise? Sure, they can bring it in. Are those clinical experts going to be around? So those are some of the potential risks and how people might think about those risks. On the other hand, a smaller tech company, they already have invested years and dollars into developing digital medicine products or platforms for those products. Those platforms are in your target therapy area pharma company. And furthermore, they have the clinical and regulatory expertise. So, but they are small, and that's a flag from your procurement perspective and other areas. And if you think about a technology company, let's take this example of a smaller company. They have invested in developing a platform. Now they have matched their product with the therapy area at a pharma company. Potentially that's a synergy. But if the project never evolves beyond the pilot, that's a risk for the technology company. Not only it's a financial risk, it's also reputational risk. Remember, the next pharma client is looking for a track record. And from other research that we have conducted around innovation, extremely protracted sales cycles, not only are they a disincentive for technology companies, they're also a financial risk for them. So I just wanted to present that as basically a set of risks and trade-offs.
Natasha, I'm just listening to that and I'm thinking about how our membership often shares with us some sort of questions or pain points. So Brett, before we come to you, I'm just going to remind folks who have dialed in and have joined us today, if any of you would like to comment on anything we're talking about, if you'd like to pose a question, feel free to raise your hand, type it into the chat box or the Q&A. We're monitoring those. We will leave plenty of time for discussion. And if any of these things that we're talking about sort of pique a reaction from you, we want to hear it. So just want to remind folks who may have joined a couple minutes after the hour of how you can get involved. Brett, Natasha laid out some considerations here. They are borne out by the evidence in our report. What have you seen as strategies to overcome some of these challenges? And what have you seen as perhaps those red flags that should be considered red flags?
Yeah, so there's the pristine world of how things should be, and then there's pragmatic realities of how things often play out, particularly with large organizations involved. So what we see playing out quite a bit, especially in the last couple of years, is what I sometimes call executive bright shiny object syndrome, where a senior executive at XYZ biopharma or med tech says, we need a digital strategy, we need a big partnership, and that kind of comes down from on high. But the actual end state ambition of where that organization wants to be at the other end isn't completely defined. And those are where we see things going sideways in the real world, where there's a lot of ambition up front, press release, but the hard work of thinking through what's the end state ambition isn't there. And that frankly creates risk for the biopharma innovator and for the tech company, whether it's a startup or a hyperscaler partner, because it doesn't create that clarity. And so we like to ground in, what's the end state ambition and getting that clear, because that then speaks to the operational model. So, and that, when you double click on that, we think it varies widely by the therapeutic area. That matters what the end state ambition is, because, some therapeutic areas lend themselves to more of a digital companion strategy. Others lend themselves more to a digital therapeutic strategy. And so thinking through those levels of, granularity and end state ambition, then start to make it pretty clear what the partnering strategy is. And so for some, if I put myself in the shoes of a biopharma innovator, sometimes a arm's length equity investment, partnering strategy makes a lot of sense. With more, sometimes as molecule collaborations have been structured in years past, with an option to buy in the future if certain milestones are met, but let's leave the innovator alone. Some therapeutic areas lend themselves to, this is actually going to be core to our business, and we're going to have multiple interventions out in the market. And we know that we want to have a relationship with the patient. And that leads to a conversation that says, patient services and our core R&D drug franchise and commercial models around the therapeutic and digital engagement are actually converging, no pun intended, and will become the same thing over time. That then leads to a conclusion. We shouldn't outsource. Arm's length is not good, because we need to have this muscle, in our organization, from how we think about, generating evidence in a clinical trial all the way through to how we engage with patients once a therapeutic and potentially a digital companion are approved. So that's where we see things fall down in terms of the experimentation, in the market. And I think, if we use the Gartner hype cycle, I think we probably have seen a little bit of the hype cycle up, lots of big press releases over the last number of years. There's probably a little bit of trough of disillusionment, if you're familiar with the Gartner hype cycle, because some of those press releases, if you go do the forensics on them, haven't played out as the press release, played them out. But I'm a big fan of the future. The quote, "The future's already here, it's just not even really distributed." The good news is we're starting to actually see us coming out of that sort of, hype for real practical, positive implications for patients. And I honestly think some of the changes, COVID was not a good thing, obviously, but there, some of the positive things are some of these digital trends I think have accelerated things by a couple of years from their natural pace, and I think will get us to the end game on this topic faster.
Jennifer, if I may add to the question, please. That's okay, yeah. And this is largely from the vantage point of the technology company. So to your your question around secret sauce for partnering, and this is a little bit of inside baseball just on the work that we've done. I think this goes without saying, but I think it's important to emphasize that really clearly, from the standpoint of the technology company, really clearly demonstrating a commitment to patient outcomes or the ultimate value of what we're working on together, versus simply being just having great tech and just focusing on the tech or the tool is really important. And being authentic and really believing that in everything that you say and how you message it and how you operate, I think that's crucial. And then the second thing is, from the tech partner standpoint, really making sure you understand your client, the business, how the organizational culture, how they're organized, really understanding their portfolio, and being able to speak their language, I think is crucial. Those might be fairly obvious points, or perhaps even sound cliche, but in our experience, that's been really important for those truly enduring and successful partnerships, and launching really interesting digital companions and tools.
It's really interesting reflecting on this, isn't it? That some of the key themes are sort of understand the people that you're working with, their values, their mission, what good looks like, what the future state looks like that you're ostensibly driving towards together. And also this idea that regardless of mechanism, that it shouldn't be an arm's length relationship. There shouldn't be silos involved. It should be an actual partnership, like the word we choose. But it's funny, isn't it, that we have to remind ourselves, especially in this very, very competitive, sort of fast-paced world of sort of digital health innovation, that those are the core values that will be supported. I think that came out in the report. And certainly, again, going back to the relationship that we've enjoyed in doing this work together, that you have with your clients and that we have with our community here at DiMe, that's an absolute core value here, right? It's collaborative. It's communicative, and thus far it's sort of being borne out that really has enormous value, sort of double bottom line value almost. I want to tease a couple things out. So it's interesting. You talked about the hype cycle, Brett. One of the things that we've been promoting a lot here at DiMe is we have our digital endpoints library. So that's a use of technology in biopharma where we've had this almost growth. We've had this enormous growth. And over the last sort of 13, 14 months that we've been maintaining this library of endpoints. And it was important to sort of both of us, I think, to examine different areas. So the focus of this particular report and the findings here are actually not around the use of digital technologies as measures or endpoints, but actually thinking about what about when we use these digital products, the potential for innovation to be digital therapeutics, where the software itself is sort of the active agent, and or when the digital product is a sort of evidence-based companion that goes out into the world with the active molecule. It's interesting though, and I think a lot of tension that we discovered in the report, and I'm sure you all experience and sort of work with clients both on the vendor side and biopharma, is there's this sort of inherent tension with this idea of, is digital trying to squeeze out the world of active molecules, or can they be more than the sum of the parts? And I wonder if you wanted to react to that based on what's the stance that you've seen being most valuable, what was uncovered during the report, and what else have you seen in terms of ways of thinking about this sort of perceived tension that's been quite valuable to think going forward? And maybe, Brett, we can start with you.
Yeah, it's a great question. And the tension is there. And I think there's also, and this gets a little bit back to the executive bright shiny object, like a lot of the senior executives who want strategies don't ferret out this level of nuance in the making of decisions, right? And it's complicated and it is nuanced. So to answer your question, I think some of the tension goes away when you start to think about the end game and the therapeutic area and how you operate in that space, right? So some areas show great promise where the digital intervention itself can lead to better outcomes or better quality of life that are measurable. And by the way, I love your measurable endpoints library. I think getting to some level of standards of how we think about those endpoints and consistently measure it across studies is going to move the field forward light years as that gets traction. But that editorial comment aside, some digital interventions are going to show great promise in some therapeutic areas, mental health, and other areas like that. I think there's great evidence that there's great promise there. I think in other areas, though, there's going to be some gray area, the line between a digital companion and the intervention itself. And I think this is where some biopharma companies have a choice to make. So take oncology as an example, right? Almost every major pharma oncology portfolio, we're in the middle of a golden era of oncology innovation. And hopefully that will continue from a therapeutic perspective. But there's also some really promising things out there, like the Bosch study from a couple of years ago that showed simple digital interventions in stage 4 non-small cell lung cancer patients to just collect some basic information and provide that back to the care team actually led to better quality of life and outcomes. So what do you do with that, right? I believe, I might get the exact data wrong, but I think it actually extended, it was a randomized trial. I think just that simple act of collecting data daily and feeding it back to the care team, I think extended life by like 4 months, right? If that was a therapeutic study, that would be on the cover of Time magazine. If people still get Time magazine about the next cancer breakthrough, right? So how do you think about that as a pharma company, right? A pretty simple intervention leads to better outcomes and quality of life, but like, what does that mean for you, right? Is that a digital therapeutic? Well, is anybody ever going to reimburse for it? Probably not. But is that additional value you can bring to the healthcare ecosystem as a pharma company? And if so, how do you do that? Because historically, patients and doctors don't want a pharma company having a relationship with the patient, right? In fact, that's been taboo. So it brings a whole bunch of operating model, regulatory challenges, and other things to think about in addition to the actual technology. And so that tension between digital companion versus digital therapeutic is real, making that explicit choice, but recognizing, like the example I just used in oncology, sometimes there's going to be some things that sit in the middle, and really thinking through who in the ecosystem has the incentive to bring that innovation to the patient is another thing to think about, which I think will drive not just tech collaborations, but also potentially the need for pharma to think differently about partnering with a disease advocacy group, because a patient and a doctor in cancer may not want the pharma company to bring that digital companion, but maybe the advocacy group has the trust to do it because they don't have a profit motive. So anyway, those are the complexities that need to be worked through, and that tension, I love the way you framed it, Jennifer, is real. Again, I come back to, at the risk of sounding like a consultant, you got to know where you want to get to and have thought through it, because then you can back out how you get there.
I'm not a consultant, and I'm a big fan of, if you don't know where you're going, anywhere will get you there. So I think this is critically important, and it's interesting. I think what you draw out, which is what we think about often, and I'm curious to hear from Natasha and Asif if you have any sort of reactions to this, is, there is no one size fits all approach. There hasn't been in drug development ever. Why should there be when we think about sort of, digital products? This idea of sort of critical thinking, always trying to find synergies where we can, and when we can't, we're looking for gaps, right? That it seems obvious, but I think that the hype and the rapid pace of all of this has thrown people off a little bit. So, a lot of the approaches that have served us very, very well, actually, for a long time still apply. And I think that's actually quite sort of comforting when there's a lot of sort of new activity on deck. I want to poll the audience, but I also want to make sure I don't skip over any comments you might have, Natasha or Asif. Is there anything you want to sort of comment on vis-a-vis the sort of the tensions that we've been discussing between sort of software and molecules?
Well, I think it's not an either or proposition as far as what's going to be used in clinical practice, or if patients decide they're going to try something on their own, if it's a digital companion because it's a discretionary product. But for pharma companies, I think it's a difficult business decision, because if you start going down the digital therapeutics route, you have to throw away your drug development playbook. You have to basically create new rules, new expertise. You have to think more like a device manufacturer, but now it's a device manufacturer that kind of operates like a consumer tech company. That's a lot of new things to do, and the revenue model is not the same. So the decision as to who will own the digital therapeutics space, the answer I don't think is known yet. Because it's not a straightforward business decision.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on that. And Jennifer, you made this point that there is no one-size-fits-all approach, and that's absolutely true. Every company has to make sort of a broad strategic decision about what's most important for them as it pertains to this decision around digital therapeutics, the digital therapeutics path or the companion path. Of course, it's a function of which TAs they play in and what's ultimately their strategic ambition. How do they want to compete relative to their peers? So to that end, and to the point, and I think Natasha makes a really good point. I think the therapeutics trend is a complex one, and the decisions that are required to go down that path do require changes in process and mindset and thinking, much more so than I think the decision to play in the companion space. So we have, and it's borne out in our research and in the paper, we found out pretty consistently that most of our biopharma partners are starting with the digital companion trend, investing in that space, looking to see if they can make a differentiated patient experience with the companion before they delve into the space with therapeutics.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Brett.
No, I think the only other thing I'd add is we touched on it, but haven't double clicked on it yet, is the reimbursement side of this and the business model side of this. Across the board, like the business model hasn't been sorted. So there's great evidence emerging that these types of digital medicine products, whether it be a companion or a therapeutic, can have huge value to the healthcare system and to patients. But as we know, that doesn't always mean it gets rewarded. And what's the sustainable business model around that? Whether that's a biopharma trying to think about how they think about it in the context of their business model relative to the therapeutic business model, or whether that's a standalone tech company or startup trying to do something, is what's the sustainable business model around this, which further confounds the clarity on some of these choices.
Yeah, and I'll just add one more. Sorry, at the risk of piling.
No, don't apologize. This is great. But
I did see that in the Q&A, this question on regulatory. And in fact, that's a really significant question and a significant decision that dictates the path that you choose. Obviously, there is very specific guidance. When we're talking digital therapeutics, you are indeed going into a much more rigorous sort of regulatory process and requirement. And there's very specific guidance that's set forth by the FDA and other bodies around what kind of evidentiary needs are required to pass the muster there. And when we talk about therapeutics, we're beginning to talk about software as a medical device. On the companion side, there is a slightly different threshold. Still, there's validation required. Still, you need to engage the FDA. Still, you need to pass some important guidelines, but it's not nearly as complex or as involved. So the regulatory framework and the requirements is often a determinant for which path to go forward as from the vantage point of the biopharma client.
Asif, you did a really lovely job actually of answering Mohammed's question. Mohammed, I've actually sort of bumped you up for a second. If you'd like to unmute yourself, is there anything you'd like to react to in Asif's response? Any follow-up questions before we move to a poll?
Yeah, can you hear me? Is it okay?
We've got you.
Okay, excellent. So thanks a lot, Ahmed, for your answer, specifically when it comes to regulatory framework. So actually for all DTX and so on, I do believe that it's more linked to medtech rather than pharmaceutical companies, because here we are talking about medical devices, right? And now, if as you may know, so for example, we have a lot of challenges with the new regulatory frameworks when it comes, for example, to MDR in Europe. So medical device regulation is very challenging for all medtech companies. So now when it comes actually to digital therapeutics, there is no specific landscape or framework for these products, which can, for example, can limit a little bit the distribution of these products into the market. You know what I mean? So here I do believe one of the major thinks is that the countries and regulators should put in place a specific framework for digital medicine and digital therapeutics, rather than follow the same MDR, for example, or medical device common framework.
Yeah, so I can respond. So I agree with you, Mohammed. The regulatory science around this absolutely needs to evolve in parallel to the data science, the behavioral science, and the other sciences that need to evolve to make this a reality for our healthcare systems. And I agree, if the default regulatory position is the traditional, put in quotes, medical device paradigm, there will be tension in the regulatory science around this. I think, I'm not a regulatory expert, so I'll preface this by saying that, but I do think things like the software as a medical device pre-check program that the FDA is experimenting with, and paradigms like that are at least progressively leading in the right direction to try to start to address it. Obviously, still progress to make there. But this is where there is an analog to my opening comments. Like the journey we've been on with regulators around real world evidence has been a journey. It's an important topic to get right for patients and for safety. And so it should be a journey, but it's a journey that we're on. And I think, we'll, like any journey, we'll stub our toes. And I think getting back to your question and your point, I think we're just at an earlier stage of the journey on some of the regulatory science around this stuff than in other areas. But great points.
Mohammed, thank you so much for your question and for your comments as well. They're really insightful. And I think it sort of allows us to tease out a theme here, right? Which is the need for thinking in a sort of fit for purpose approach, extrapolating what we can and sort of forging new pathways where we have to. There's a couple of things I want to make sure that we continue to touch on. And there's a really terrific question that's come in from Gerald Finken. So Gerald, you should, if you'd like to, be able to unmute yourself and ask your question directly to our experts.
Yeah, as the discussions are taking place, I keep coming back to the different ideas and the technologies, like who's the true customer? And by that, I mean, I think about like root cause. Is it the patient? Is it the healthcare provider? Is it the pharma company? Is it all three? It's like, well, you can't have all three. Like the idea, I'm struggling, like who is the true customer here? Because if you're concerned about pharma, like I wear Fitbits and iWatch, but if I'm in a clinical trial, I'm not telling them that, but yet data is being collected on me when I'm in a trial. Anyhow, does that make sense? I'm just wondering who's the true customer? Thank you. Thank you.
Anybody want to take that? If not, I can.
I'll take a first cut, and it's interesting. So Gerald, you listed a few sort of critically important stakeholders, from the patients themselves, which we're all here to serve, to the healthcare providers, to the payers. And then you said, and we can't serve them all. And I thought, oh, but we might have to. And I'm really curious to hear from my other colleagues. And I know it sort of breaks the mold a little bit. And I will share openly, at DiMe, we're committed to bringing all of these different experts together in pursuit of our common goal. And every time I talk to someone who does marketing, they're like, no, pick one. And I'm like, I won't. Everyone's important and everyone has a role. And I think that this is, in terms of our thinking even about products, perhaps a new paradigm, that we have to be comfortable being uncomfortable in this space, where we have to actually think about meeting the needs of the patients first and foremost, while making sure that we're certainly not making things worse for providers, hopefully making things better. And we're figuring out how to communicate value to payers. I'm not sure we get to pick one, but I'm really curious to hear what my Deloitte colleagues think. And then Gerald, let's get a reaction from you as well. Brett, you said you had some thoughts.
Yeah, sure. I mean, everybody has a slide that shows the patient at the center. I think we all know that, unfortunately, that's not always the case. So, Gerald, it's an awesome question. And I think the answer is it depends a little bit on the exact type of situation we're talking about, the disease area, and which stakeholder's vantage point. So there are some great direct to consumer, where the consumer, i.e. the patient, is actually the true end customer, because it's a direct, to that individual model. So, sometimes especially if it's looking for some kind of traditional reimbursement, I think, Jen, your points are extremely well taken. Like, it's a complicated ecosystem of you have multiple customers, right? You got the physician and the care teams are your customer, because if you don't take into consideration their workflow and when they need data and when they need, and have interactions, you could lose. It doesn't provide value for the patient in that scenario, you lose. And if the payer, whether that be a government or a health plan, doesn't see or can't measure the value it's creating, you may not have a business model. So in those scenarios, it's high degree of complexity, but I think you have to almost treat all three, as your ultimate, customer. Now, if you're a pharma company, it's interesting. We advocate a good place to start on this journey, if you're a pharma company, is in patient services, right? So if you're familiar with what a pharma company can do in patient services, historically, it's been fairly light touch. It's reimbursement support. It's basic medical information about your products. That is shifting to, especially with more personalized therapies, where the pharma companies are providing a lot more support that the healthcare system is just not equipped to provide. And so, in terms of building the muscle, like there, I think pharma companies are starting to build a muscle where the actual patient and the teams around them are actually true customers, and not just, doctors writing scripts and patients consuming it. So anyway, it's a great question. It's a complicated one. Hopefully that provides a couple different points of insight to think about, at least from what we're seeing.
Well, I don't think
Gerald,
this question is
oh,
only
Natasha,
distinct from other healthcare situations. Even when we think of traditional drugs, the patient that takes the drugs is the patient, but somebody else is paying for it. But I would like to push a little bit on Brett's point about starting in patient services. That's fine. But I think some of the blind spots that we may have seen in the research, or at least things that didn't get discussed, is how are we going to educate the provider community about the digital tools? It doesn't appear that the companies have given much thought just yet on how to engage providers, whether it's prescribing physicians or pharmacists. And if you are thinking about them being supportive or being promoting of your technology, not only should there be evidence that the technology is good for the benefit of the patient, but there should also be some benefit to the providers. So in some regards, maybe the company should be thinking about how the data could be shared and be useful for other players in the value chain. Because if you think about patients, like in a, let's say they're taking some kind of specialty drug and now they have a companion for that drug, multiple people are gathering data from that patient. The providers are checking in on them. Are they adhering to the drug? Are they having side effects? The specialty pharmacy is calling on them. Are you adhering? Are you having side effects? Now there's a digital tools checking in on them.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, I mean, I agree with everything that Brett and Natasha are saying, and sort of, I'll give a slightly different vantage point. I agree that, it's a multifaceted answer, but from the standpoint of a firm that develops digital companions, what we found is that it's critically important to design for a fabulous experience. And in order to do that, you really need to understand the patient experience and the HCP experience. And how we've solved for that in the past is actually stood up advisory councils for both patients and HCPs, and co-created and co-designed our products with their experience, their emotional and their needs in mind. And that allows us to think about how best to deliver and deploy a companion that meets the needs of the patient, and the HCP is sort of crucial to the success of that companion.
It's really terrific insight. Gerald, did we help or hinder?
Both. It's like my head's going to explode after that. Great answers, and the response as you're speaking, I immediately came back to, is like, in device companies are listening first and foremost are looking for funding, So it isn't any of the three that we talked about. It's like, where are we? And then all I could think about when Natasha was talking about is maybe the issue is, like you say, it's all three, Jennifer, and I say you said the same, but then I start thinking about timelines. We always know the XY axis, but it's a three-dimensional model, Z, and where along the timeline, the Z, are we first looking for the funding, then need pharma, then, or patient first or pharma first, and maybe it's a timeline thing about at the root of our, or root cause, root decision making, maybe just longer time. Anyhow, great response. Thank you very much. I've got to think about it.
Of course, and actually that's a really nice segue, Vishal. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you from my side, I think. If you'd like to unmute yourself, you can pose your question that you typed into the Q&A directly, which builds on sort of Gerald's really nicely.
Okay, so thanks everyone. Thanks for a nice panel of experts sharing all these views. I think all this is, as Brett mentioned, it's very much dependent on therapeutic area where you have more digital influence versus like somewhere where you're still building. But I think the key for me is it's an integrated ecosystem. And who do you find as the hardest stakeholder to influence? I know everybody has that patient in the center and 25 things around it, right? So whether it's Deloitte or BCG or McKinsey or whatever, always patient is the center. And if you go to pharma company, if you go to provider, payer, whatever, the key is who is the hardest stakeholder to influence, because ultimately who pays for that? That's the key thing. You're getting into the reimbursement models because it's a regulated industry. I think that'll be good to seek your viewpoint.
I'll take it. I think payers are the hardest ones to convince. Brett, what do you think?
Depending on the disease area, not followed far behind by clinicians and the care teams and how they like to interact with patients. Those are, sometimes these things fall down at both of those levels. Interestingly enough, building on Asif's point, our experience has been, if you get the experience right, the adoption by the patient is actually not the barrier anymore. If you can create the right value for the patient with the right experience and contribute back the value to them, that's actually, I think we're if we, again, assuming good experience, we're sort of past that as one of the primary barriers. So I think it's the business, I'll take reimbursement in the business model more broadly around some of this. And I connect those two because the answer may not be that there's a sustainable business model for a standalone digital therapeutic. It may be that the digital therapeutic has to be coupled to a business model that has a monetization path that isn't the actual reimbursement of the digital therapeutic, right? And so if we go back to some earlier comments, if we believe the hypothesis, which I'm guessing most people on a DiMe event would believe, that digital interventions, whether companion or therapeutic, are going to create all sorts of value for patients and the healthcare system more broadly. But if the reimbursement pathway for standalone digital therapeutics is not clear, then the question is, from a business model perspective, do these have to be part of a bigger value creation opportunity? Whereas the digital therapeutic just becomes a feature in that broader value creation for the healthcare system, for the sustainable business model.
Thank you, Brett.
Vishal, great question. And I'm going to riff on this just in one little way. And it's a little Pollyanna, but I think it's really important, which is, I agree with what's been said, which is, it's potentially our payer colleagues with fast followers from our sort of clinical colleagues. I also think, let's look to our tech colleagues and learn some lessons here. Let's also not blame the user. I think that we need to do a lot of education. And that may be frustrating, but it is also a standard characteristic of any blazing a new trail industry. You have to educate the market first. And I definitely observe a good amount of frustration, very reasonably, from sort of evidence-based sort of digital products that aren't well received yet. And I think it comes back to, we haven't earned the trust yet as a field. We're well on the way to getting there. I think many products and many approaches, not all, but many, are very worthy of this trust. But I also think that part of it too is, if this is a continual roadblock, if we continue to face challenges with our payer colleagues, for example, let's understand what the root cause of sort of their reticence to sort of embrace this is, you know, how do we do a better job of education? How do we serve up? How do we sort of demonstrate the value here instead of, you know, getting frustrated, trying to think about how we solve the problem? And again, I go back to this idea, this is not new in healthcare or otherwise. Early movers have a lot of education work to do. Frankly, that's a lot of the work we try and take off the shoulders of industry at DiMe, and we do the sort of communication, the research, the education piece. Hopefully this is part of it. But Vishal, absolutely terrific question.
Yeah, I think just one thing I want to add there is I think pandemic probably has been a blessing in disguise, where from the provider community perspective, there have been a lot of bottlenecks early on, but now because of telehealth opportunities and things like that, I think there has been a little bit of more swiftness toward this digital from that perspective. Thank you.
Terrific, Vishal. Thanks so much for a great question. What I want to do, I want to make sure we get to, we'll do a little bit of audience participation, shall we? I'm throwing a poll up on the screen. Let's think about this. You know, if we all, you know, hypothetically or otherwise, buy into this idea that sort of digital interventions are indeed strategically important to our biopharma colleagues, how should we think about sort of positioning the new expertise that's required for success? I'll leave the poll up for just a minute or two longer. I see a lot of votes coming in, and then I'll share it with everyone, and we'll have a chat about it before we wrap up. Okay, let me. Hopefully folks can see the results up here. So we see, it's interesting. Developing from scratch is not popular, which I think is a good thing. Really interesting to see sort of internal competencies sort of achieved through partnerships rise to the top. And as we've discussed, there's a number of different models for that. Acquisition and sort of outsourcing also featuring there as sort of runners up. I'm going to put my Deloitte colleagues on the spot a little bit. So thank you for your patience with me. How are you reacting to these results? If you had to make a recommendation to folks on the line for, you know, based on your experience, based on the research that you've done, what is the best model in current state for sort of success for biopharma embracing the sort of fast-paced world of digital technologies, specifically digital companions and digital therapeutics?
Right, you're on mute.
Bingo! It's usually me who gets there first.
It usually happens at least once during a Zoom call, right?
Yep.
For me, it comes back to first principles and where's my 13-year-old son plays ice hockey. So where's the puck going? So, you know, if you believe the trend for biopharma is that the healthcare system writ large is going to continue to challenge the value that that pharma is creating for patients and all of the pressures that come with that. I don't know how I believe that digital health is here to stay. I think it's hard to argue that it's not. Not building a competency in-house, either through partnership, acquisition, or otherwise, is sort of hard to imagine that doesn't create significant risk over a 5 or 10 year time horizon if you're not, because the value is going to get created. We're going to figure out a lot of this complexity, and completely sticking your head in the sand and thinking that, you know, our sole value proposition is going to be the therapeutic, I think is probably not the right strategy for most pharma. So I agree with the poll as a general trend line. And Natasha, Asif?
Yeah.
Well, from the research, it seems like the answer isn't clear yet. I think there could be several models. And again, it depends on how all in the pharma company is going to jump into this, or whether it's going to, the digital health is going to be somewhat of a side business.
Yeah, no, I'm with Brett, and maybe because we work too closely together. But I personally believe that this is a trend that is here to stay, and for our biopharma partners and organizations to be truly successful, they really do need to build that internal competency, and that is borne out. I mean, we've seen a lot of these organizations invest in digital organizations and groups and capabilities. And I think that'll continue to be bearing out as this trend plays out over the next few years.
Fantastic. I'm conscious of time. I'm also conscious that we live in a world where everyone is likely back to back. And for some people, pretending to have some kind of lunch for 3 minutes might be nice. So let's wrap it up here. I'm sharing the screen because I want to thank my colleagues at Deloitte, and in particular, the authors of the paper, who have very graciously agreed to share their emails in case anyone has follow-up questions. I also want to take a moment to thank Brett. Your leadership here has been fantastic. Natasha, the success of this project under your research stewardship has been tremendous. And Asif, your ability to come in and provide sort of critical sort of insights has just been top notch. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you for joining everyone on the line. For fellow DiMe colleagues, we do have an event coming up, I think in a couple of weeks. We work with a lot of presidential innovation fellows across federal government, whether it's with our work at VA, whether it's our work at FDA, whether it's our work with BARDA. This is a phenomenal entrepreneur in residence program. Applications are currently open, closing on May 14th. So for anyone who's keen, we're hosting a webinar on April 8th to chat with some PIFs, as they are called affectionately, and learn about that opportunity in case it piques your interest. But for today, just thank you to my colleagues. Thank you to Natasha, to Brett, to Asif. Thank you to all of you on the line. What a tremendous conversation. And as we said, the slides, the recording, and most importantly, the paper will be posted on the DiMe Journal Club page within probably a day or so. I don't want to, I want to promise reasonable things of my team. So thank you, everyone. Appreciate the hour you spent with us today. Hopefully everything we discussed and everything in the report is of great value. And as always, we welcome feedback. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I wanted to